Rachel wants to build a bookcase for upstairs, and for starters, I got her to draw a drawing of it, but she did that in inches, but that's okay. Her problem. And so then we went to the Home Depot and bought some construction lumber. These pieces here, which are mostly good. This one's got parts that isn't very usable.
Why don't we just pick out the side pieces first? Like this one, and this one, and those two.
Now she's got to mark off how much of that we're going to use so we can cut that off before we run it through the planer.
And leave 1 extra inch.
Yeah. So I think a theme of this video is all the little things you run into when you don't have a ton of experience already.
Cut. Alright, this time. You have to press really hard or something?
Yes.
Alright.
And these pieces need a little bit of straightening out before we glue them together to make the sides of the bookcase. And one of the pieces ended up not quite straight enough. It's not just the jointer, it's also how you push it across that determines straightness sometimes.
And on both sides?
Sure, yeah. So now you just put them down on a workbench facing each other and start putting clamps on there. And best to push them against each other straight away, even before you clamp them, just to get that glue kind of in between.
Ooh, look, it's moving.
You didn't put the clamp on square, that's the problem.
I didn't put it on square. Oh, sure.
Okay, and line it up, put it on perpendicular with the pads, and always just put it on the side so it doesn't...
okay. It's still moving. Oh dear.
That's why I keep a bit of extra length.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll just put another one down. And then... Doesn't that work? It's called?
It won't. That's because you put that on the same crooked way.
Did I?
So it's just pulling with it instead of against it. If we want to move it this way, then you move that so that it brings this way a little bit, and that will bring it back.
Okay.
If the glue hasn't set yet.
I don't think it's set yet.
Oh, and we'll move that one too to bring it over. So just go against the angle there, and that will... And we couldn't get those pieces to move back. The glue had already started to set. Fortunately, we have a little bit of extra length. And that's good because they're actually lined up pretty well. Yeah.
And
two more.
Clamped enough? But like how tight?
How tight to tighten the clamp? Anybody with experience doesn't even think about that anymore. There's another one for you.
Like.
Yeah, it's good.
It's
good.
Yeah. It's gonna be extra heavy. All that glue. Right. I wipe this off.
Just find that drawer.
And what do I do with that?
Just wipe it with your hands.
Okay.
Just push it across.
It's probably a more efficient way of doing this. Still not. Did I put it too much on one side?
Clamp between the two boards. That forces them into perfect alignment.
And that end's pretty square.
And you used less glue this time.
Yeah, a little bit.
Experience.
Yeah.
I can't put that much force on it with these ones, so we may have missed that opportunity. Oh, that's coming. Okay, good.
Now I was going to use this bit.
Yeah.
It's kind of the best bit of that log.
Yes.
cutting a strip of oak off of this big long board to make the trim that go along the side of the bookcase. And this is where she stalled the saw, so I put down the camera and lunged for the off switch. The photos are from my time-lapse camera.
And also you want to tilt it to go with the wood afterwards, so...
Okay, that board was a little more challenging than I thought it was, especially towards the end where it hooks a little bit, so I ended up putting it on the jointer to straighten that before cutting it the rest of the way. But I stalled or near stalled the saw a couple of times too. It's only a hybrid table saw, not that powerful. Then cutting off the bit of the length that we don't need, which is also kind of crooked. And then through the planer to make the sides smooth. And then jointing one edge of it straight before ripping it to final width on the table saw. And here I was just telling her not to get her fingers that close to the cutter head.
Now when I cut this down the middle, and to be conservative, I'll go for the thinnest part here, and that is almost 24 millimeters. So now let's set that to 12. And since the blade also has thickness, I just set it so that the middle of the blade is 12 millimeters from the fence. And that way we've got half the blade thickness missing from each side. Except this is really hard to do one-handed. Okay, with Rachel holding a camera now, let's do that. That's much easier. This fence doesn't stay parallel unless I push it forward. There we go. And to make sure we're going to stay up against the fence.
So that makes the trim for the size of the bookcase. Now we just need to rip some shorter pieces to make trim for the top and bottom. And I cut those to width, and I cut them down the middle to make the trim pieces for the top and bottom.
Ugly! I thought the other side would look better.
Too.
I'll have to cut another piece.
Yeah.
Let's just top over here. Can't use that.
We have a lot of glue squeeze out from laminating the boards together, and if that glue squeeze out is towards the bottom in the planer, that will lift the stock up and mess up the other side. So we're scraping off the thickest parts of that so that it won't mess up in the planer. But before we run the bookcase sides through the thickness planer, we want to glue the trim on the front, and before we glue that on, we need a nice straight square edge, which is why we're putting it on the jointer.
With glue on just one side, you need more.
More? Alright.
Yeah, a bit more than that, and then spread it. Okay, maybe not that much more. So if that's perfectly flush, that's best, yeah. And then do the middle, and then the other end. Because if it's bent, by doing the middle first, it's easier to bend it to be to conform. So this side bends quite a bit, so if you can kind of... No, just leave that one and push it outwards as you put that one on to try to get it to conform a bit better. Clamp, bottom of the clamp.
What about the bottom?
It's not hooked up, it's not hooked on. I just added this clamp here to force that out there, and this is still stuck on there good, so we just bent the trim to fit the board.
And for the trim piece on the other side, I just put the camera on a tripod so I could help too, because we only have so much time. The trim wasn't entirely flush everywhere, so I'm just doing that with a hand plane. I could use a router, but hand plane is quicker. Because if the trim sticks out too much and it's on the bottom side when it goes through the thickness planer, that means we end up cutting board instead of trim to make it flush. The top and bottom bits we ran over the jointer first to make them straight, but not for the sides.
Like that?
Too much.
Too much.
Make sure it's on the... Yeah, that's way too much. Yeah, that's good for starters.
And then running the top and bottom and sides through the thickness planer so that it's all smooth and the jointer becomes nice and flush. And we're always pre-feeding a sacrificial piece before the workpiece, and then another workpiece or the sacrificial piece again, and that way the planer snipe from the ends doesn't end up on the workpiece. And we just popped the planer's internal breaker. But after letting the planer and the breaker cool down for a bit, we were good to go again. Pop the breaker again. With that breaker popping so easily, we're only taking off 0.5 millimeter at a time. So we're ripping the boards to their final width first, just to make it a tiny bit easier for the planer. And gotta finish that planer pass where it last popped the breaker. But that slight reduction in width wasn't enough to stop the breaker popping problems, but we managed to get the boards planed, and the next day I figured maybe it's time to change the planer knives. Then it was time to cut the top and bottom to length. First cut one end square, then measure to the other end, and measure to the front edge, not the middle, because that way you can actually read it off the blade. But it turns out the boards didn't end up quite the same length, maybe a millimeter's worth of difference, so here I'm using my trick to get them up to the same length. But I wasn't perfect either, there was about 0.5 millimeter difference.
Well,
Isn't that funny, though?
So I'm just making sort of a spring cut to trim the longer board to be the same. And then cutting the sides of the bookcase square until length, which the table saw sled is able to handle just fine. And then flipping the board around to cut the other end, and every woodworker kind of intuitively knows this. Flip the board end over end, not rotating it, so you don't end up on the wrong side of it. Don't kick the tape measure! Now Rachel wanted this bookcase to be box joint because she wanted to learn how to do box joints. But with workpieces as long as the size of the bookcase, the box joint jig really isn't suitable, so we used the slot mortiser. The pantry rotor could have done this too, but I prefer the slot mortiser. I can actually have more reach this way, and it can do 2 workpieces at once. And for this type of operation, the rotor bit really kicks out a lot of shavings, which is why I'm standing here with the hose, trying to catch most of it. And switching to the other ends of the long boards, my long reach clamps are really handy for holding these wide boards in place. Now my slot mortiser doesn't have enough reach to work all the way across these boards, so we're just cutting the last little bit straight, but that's okay because that'll be held very rigid by the backing plywood.
Oh, that's too tight.
the tight one? Maybe that's the tight one.
Yeah, that's the tight one.
So we'd actually realized that these joints were a little bit too tight on an earlier test fit, and the way we fixed that is after cutting the slot, adjusting the crank by 1/6 of a turn and cutting it again to widen the slot a little bit, but we hadn't done that on all the joints.
I just figured the...
Well, one end is tight, the other end is not tight. It's not that one is tight and the other one
This
isn't.
one has T's on the end, so I figured it was
That's tight. Oh yeah,
definitely not tight.
that makes a big difference. Oh yeah.
And this is where the strip sander is super handy for making joints less tight.
You're not going to flip it around?
Sorry, what?
You're not going to flip it?
Doesn't help. I need to cut sand here and I couldn't.
Okay.
But I know my other side has got a little bit more.
I ran out of reach on the sander, but my old strip sander has got slightly more reach.
Oh yeah, I'm watching here.
Now we still need to cut a notch in the back of the bookcase to fit around the baseboards. And then finish that cut with a jigsaw. And we also need to cut the same amount off the bottom peep. And with a fresh set of knives in the planer, we planed a tiny bit off of all the boards again, which made for a much smoother finish and no breaker popping. And now we're finally ready to glue the frame of the bookcase together.
There, got it. Yeah.
And I like to clamp a square to a joint like this, not only to hold it square, but also to pull it together. And this corner required a little bit more effort to pull it together.
Okay, ready, set, go. You gotta work fast.
Right.
Gluing the last two joints of a box at the same time is always stressful, so it's really nice not to be working alone on this one.
Right.
And this part would have also been very tricky alone. And having used that clamp to press one side of the joint together, switching to the other side and press that one too. And after that, trimming those slightly protruding box joints flush using a flush plane. And now Rachel is cutting all the boards for the shelves. But with my one-sided crosscut sled, it actually really helps to hold the other end of the board so it doesn't drop down. I guess it takes a few tries to get the hang of it. Now at this point, Rachel had to go and deal with the kids, and because we don't have enough clamps to glue the trim on all the shelves, I figured I'd do a few of them ahead of time. And now it's the next day, and Rachel is gluing on the rest of the shelf trim while I'm working on a little jig for the router that'll be very handy for the next step. And when you put a lot of glue in a joint like this, it likes to float away on you, and that can be tricky to deal with if you're not used to it and already expect it to happen.
Too much glue.
I just attached this stick to my rotor base, and I should have done that years ago. It's made to hold the rotor level while using this bit to cut a rabbet in the back of the shelf for the back to fit into, and I also need a depth stop, and that's what this part here is for. I did this myself, freehanding with a router and chiseling the rest because that's all too easy to screw up.
And now routing a roundover on the front edges, and she is routing backwards, that is going in the climb direction with the router, but that's okay, I told her to do that, there's less tear out that way. And with that router removing so little material, there's little to worry about losing control because it's a climb cut. And while Rachel is doing that, I'm cutting one end of the shelf square. I'll worry about cutting them to final length later. Also finally planing the front edge of the shelf trim. I saved that until now so we didn't have to worry about marking it up with the clamps. And with the trim glued on and planed, we can now cut the shelves to their final width. Now Rachel is rounding a slight roundover on the front edges of the shelves. But somehow it's just not cutting that roundover very well. So I explained to her, you have to press the wood down right near the router bit because those boards aren't necessarily flat, neither is the router table, so by pressing it down right by the bit, you ensure that the bit is cutting to full depth. Varnishing a project is one of my least favorite things to do, so I was happy to just let Rachel handle that. But then I couldn't help myself.
Oh, I just put on lots. Let me just...
The way I go at is like... Oh, I see. Really lots.
Yeah, so that way you're covering, especially when you got a nice easy surface like that. Yeah, maybe if you're doing it your way, it won't run so much like it does for me.
Maybe. Alright, varnishing was your least favorite part. I can take over.
There you go.
Yep.
To help keep the sides of the bookcase parallel, the middle shelf is going to be screwed in with pocket holes, And I made a special jig for that for smaller pocket holes at a steeper angle out of wood. And I was going to get Rachel to drill the actual pocket holes with that jig, but it doesn't give very much support with the drill, so you have to be really careful drilling it in. And I figured that would just be a recipe for marital strife if I got her to drill the holes with it. And now the shank hole for the screws, because I wasn't using a step drill.
Because these are for smaller screws and at a steeper angle, they end up having a much smaller pocket for the pocket holes than the ones with this blue jig. Of course, these ones will be stronger in terms of pulling, but they're really just there against shear to keep the shelf from sliding down.
And with the middle shelf temporarily in place, we can cut the other shelves to length.
Yeah, so I left too much margin there. So I'll cut it again. You're making me all nervous. Nope. How tight is it?
A millimeter of space, so you can cut off at least a millimeter. Well, that looks good. So now you can cut the next two to the exact same length.
Yep.
And now finally installing that middle shelf with the pocket holes. And then drilling all the shelf pin holes using a simple jig that I made just for this project.
So we just test fit the shelves and fitting it with the back. It does look bookcase-like from this side.
Yeah, alright. Not bad.
And just like with the last bookcase I built, it was easier to move without the back, so we didn't nail that on until we got it upstairs.
You're gonna attach it to the wall.
Yeah, somewhere to the side. Looks good.
Funky. Great.
And the motivation for this bookcase was to have another place for all the crap that usually ends up on here. And this kids' table is starting to be less cluttered now.
It's so nice. Yay. Ta-da!